Where the plates collide, the rock on the seafloor containing carbon from the dead plankton is carried deep into the earth. As it descends, this layer of rock is heated, so the rock melts, releasing carbon dioxide. And gas is returned back into the atmosphere during an eruption.
Speaking of oil, you mentioned in one of your last talks that petroleum wasn't what we thought it was, that it wasn't a fossil fuel, that it didn't come from fossil animals.
Yeah.
Is it just a mineral? Is it a mineral like any other mineral? Is that how it what would you say? What's the origin of
you see,
petroleum?
when they first found petroleum, because they were beginning to make motors and needed on axles or wheels on railroad trains and all that sort of thing. And remember, trains started in the beginning of the 19th century. Then oil went from just a lubricant to a fuel, and it made it valuable. And Rockefeller happened to be the smartest man in the business at the time, but he made most of his money, or much of it, off the transport of the petroleum as well as selling it. But one thing they realized was, because oil is putting a price on oil is like putting a price on a pail of water. You know, no initial cost. It's in the ground, and in those days they were, some of it, almost what you'd call surface mining the oil. They didn't go down deep. So in order to get the price up, they hit on the idea that they would have to make it appear to be scarce. Boy, after we take the next few barrels out, we're probably going to have to close as well. You know, that kind of thing. Well, a very fortuitous event. In 1892, there was a convention in Geneva of scientists to determine what organic substances are. Well, the definition of organic is a substance with hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And so it's usually a living substance, a tree. You analyze a dead tree, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, and grass, and so on, living things. Animals, we are hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. So at this Geneva Convention, Rockefeller took advantage of sending some scientists over who said, oil, petroleum, is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Therefore, it must be derived from the spoiling, the rotting of formerly living matter. And playing the game properly, when this scientific convention was over, they defined oil as the residue from formerly living matter. Well, that makes it a fossil fuel. I don't know why they decided to use the word fossil, but it says formerly living matter is fossil. Well, of course, today, and another thing we should know is that there has never been a fossil, a real fossil, found below 16,000 feet. And you can't argue at 16,000 as a level line, because someplace the ground sinks and so on. But 16 is what the scientists say, 16,000. We mine oil, or we drill for oil, at 30,000, 33,000, 28,000 every day of the week. So right there we rule it out that it isn't fossil fuel. It's called fossil fuel for the minds of the public to feel that it is an asset that is running out, being depleted. We talk about depletion allowance, which is a lot of, you know. And actually, if you know the world's oil supply, you know that it is not going to run out for an awfully long time. It is the second most prevalent liquid on Earth. And we haven't begun to... Well, with all that background, you see, the people in charge of the petroleum business, for perfectly reasonable business things, just like any other man in a business, wants to keep his price as high as he can get away with. And the way to do is just say, well, there's no more. The last barrel is going to cost $1,000, and then it's all done. And they preach that stuff. What bothers me is that in geology books, it's in there. The geologists say it's a fossil fuel. They've been bought. I mean, I went to a 4-year federal staff energy seminar run by the government of the United States during the so-called energy crisis. I was the participant that represented the railroad industry. The airline industry was there. Every AA, administrative assistant of senators and congressmen, was there. The CIA was there. The Defense Department was there. The State Department was there. Sometimes sitting right in front of me in the row would be Henry Kissinger with his friend, the head of Department of Defense. It's too bad I can't put the names with them. But anyway, people like that, top men in the government, sitting there listening to the federal staff energy seminar. Well, what this was doing is for 4 years, they were teaching a propaganda line to the leading people in this country, and therefore to the leading people in the world, when you include the Schlesingers, Kissinger and Schlesinger, among others. And the object of it was, as Kissinger used in his own terms when it was time for him to speak, to create a world price for oil. In other words, not 30 cents a gallon here and 90 cents a gallon there, but let's get a world price. That's their goal, and they're trying to do that for wheat and everything else. We don't realize what the controls are, whether it's oil or some of these other things. Almost everything today is being categorized at the highest price they can possibly make it go. And so calling petroleum a fossil fuel is the basis for this system with respect to petroleum. And I don't know if the name Arthur Kantrowitz rings any bell. Arthur Kantrowitz is the head of the Kantrowitz Labs set up by the AVCO company near Boston, scientific laboratories. And a great man in the scientific world. And Kantrowitz and I were sitting at a table at this seminar once, and the table happened to be all young college grad, PhD geologists. And so just to get a conversation started, I turned to Kantrowitz and I said, Arthur, what do you think about this foolishness of these speakers talking about fossil fuel? And it was kind of put up. He started laughing. He said, you know, that gets me. He says, I don't have a geology degree, but he had 1,000 other degrees. And he said, I don't understand. He said, you'd think that these heads, these other fellows at the table, we did it on purpose, start listening, you know. And he asked, he said, are you gentlemen? He says, you're here at the meeting. Are you gentlemen by any chance geologists? And one fellow, yes, I am. And the other one, yeah. He said, well, why don't you tell me? He said, why is oil? You know, and he went on like that. We brought the house down because nobody could argue with Kantrowitz. He like Einstein. People aren't going to. And he told him right there. He said, just drop it. But it's in all the books and in all the papers. But it started from that strange meeting in 1892, a scientific convention. I have a big, thick scientific encyclopedia put out by the Divan Ostrin Company that's about 15 years old now, but it has the whole story of the conference. It doesn't have the Rockefeller part, but it has the whole story of how they straightened out organic chemicals and how it was all figured, and they've got petroleum right in there.
Amazing. Amazing.
these aren't accidental things, you see. There's a dollar sign behind almost everything.
Okay. Speaking of dollar signs behind everything, I've had a question I've been curious about for a long time. As I understand it, Lyndon Johnson's first act when he became president, before 273, before any of the moves that we've heard about, was to rescind the Treasury Act 11121 or something. I can't remember the numbers, but Kennedy signed into effect in April '63, I think it was, where Kennedy put the power for minting money back into the hands of the Treasury Department and took it out of the hands of the Federal Reserve. What do you know about that act? And was that Johnson's first move to rescind that act?
Well, remember, the word act means it was legislation. A president can sign an executive order, and it has the impact of act as long as he can get it to stand that way. As long as he's president, you might say. There are a lot of executive orders. They use that and abuse it now more than they do other things. It wasn't debated in Congress. But the way the Federal Reserve System is set up and things like that, it's not too unusual to find that the president uses that kind of a paper, an order, a directive, to get certain things done. Now, with respect to the Federal Reserve, since it's not truly a function of the government, then a presidential directive would be the paper. And at that time, dollar bills came out that would be refundable in silver. I still have a few of them that I kept as souvenirs.
Everybody's kept
And you know, even a Kennedy has a problem fighting City Hall. The Federal Reserve System is pretty strong. But it was one of the things, of course, like he was also reducing seriously the oil depletion allowance. That was another thing he was cutting down. So, and this is really characteristic of the Kennedy period. He and his advisors, principal among them his father, who was a pretty brilliant old boy and a tough son of a gun, and very much in the business world, were doing things that you might say were a throwback to the Roosevelt era, or even further back to basic government. And this, of course, built Kennedy an awful lot of very serious enemies, who were enemies from the point of view that he must not be reelected in '64. That was they could not permit him to get over 1964, because the second 4 years a president is beholden to nobody. He's not going to get, you know, and Kennedy knew that. He's the one that said over and over again, it's an old Kennedy saying, not to get bad, but to get even. He said, what I'm doing is, I'm not going to get even. He said, but you watch me after '64. Then he said, I'll take care. Well, he'd tell people that kind of half joking, but half serious. And that's what caused people to rise against him, because on every side, whether you're in the petroleum business or the banking business or in the military or expecting this or that, Kennedy was putting things back where they had been and not playing favorites quite as strongly as, say, the Eisenhower administration had been doing before him. And I think that's the basis of what you're talking about, because it was just an executive paper from the White House.
But thank you. I've always wondered about that. And I wondered if it was Johnson's very first move, you know, if there was some kind of an imperative that Lyndon felt he had to erase that act first, among all the other important things he had to do the first couple of days of his presidency. That must have been very powerfully motivated.
You see,
because what did Johnson
people haven't thought enough about Johnson in the assassination. First of all, it's the first time a president in 100 years of Secret Service had been in the same motorcade or parade or building with the president. That's just not permitted. And here's Lyndon sitting back there, 2 cars behind the president. The other thing is, we know the trajectory of some of the bullets pretty clearly. And one of them, the Teg bullet, obviously, and the one in Kennedy's back, I think, went over Johnson, maybe 18 inches. When I was writing something on this back in 1975, I think it was, or maybe earlier, I had a draftsman figure the trajectory for me, and we figured Lyndon was only about 18 inches under the bullet. And you know, his first meeting with Edgar Hoover after the assassination, And Hoover had been his neighbor in Washington for 19 years. They weren't strangers to each other, and they weren't the president and another guy. They were old friends. They borrowed each other's lawnmowers, you know. Well, the first meeting with him, the first thing he said was, how many shots were fired? And Hoover said, well, we've got 3 cartridges, 3 shots. And then Johnson came right back and said, were any fired at me? Well, in the first week after that horrible episode, you can be sure that whatever paper came on his desk, he was thinking about the sound of those bullets, because they lowered that gun a little bit and they had him. And look at the record afterwards. Nixon had trouble with shots. Ford had trouble with shots. I mean, they kept those guys in line. So I wouldn't take the Johnson period, at least the first 6 months, and then a little after that he got out, more than 6 months, but as being his own initiative. I think he was following the initiative or the instructions of the people that saw to it that Kennedy was out of office.
As powerful as Johnson was.
Oh, well, he had no power. See, he lost the power with those bullets. You know, you're not powerful after bullets go over your head. You know that. What kind of power does he have? He just got the job. He's got the title. But think of the things he did. He reversed 263, the Kennedy policy, in 2 days. In 4 days, I should say. No, he was. That's what bothered him. He was not powerful. See, and then a man like Johnson, they're hard to live with, because he'd been powerful before that.
Well, that's what I meant. You know,
but we have to be realistic about these things.
Is that why maybe he thought enough to say that there was a conspiracy before he died?
Well, I'm sure he knew that the minute the bullets went off. I mean, I'm just sure he knew that, because he'd say, geez, what am I doing here? See, like that. And why was Connolly, the governor, in the same car? Well, maybe that seems nice politically, but even so, the Secret Service usually keeps the targets separated. But I don't think Johnson had a lot of choices, and I don't think he was truly, characteristically Johnson in that era right afterwards. I think he got his mind changed on a lot of things in a big hurry.